Welcome, everyone. My name is Katie O'Hara-Krebs, and I am the social media editor for Portal Libraries in the Academy. Today, I am pleased to welcome Stephanie Caloia, AFSCME Archivist at Wayne State University. Today, she's here to speak with us about her article that was most recently in Portal, 50 Years of Labor History, Preservation, and Progress, The Evolution of the Walter P. Reuther Library. This article can be found on Portal's preprint site in volume 25 and issue 4. And the article is free to read, and viewers may access the article by navigating to the Johns Hopkins Press preprint site for Portal. Thank you so much for being with us today, Stephanie.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Sure. So I wonder if you could give our viewers a little bit of some background on the inspiration or motivation behind your topic, your research topic.
2025 marked the 50th anniversary of the building in which I work. So that's the Walter P. Reuther Library, Archives of Labor and Urban Affairs at Wayne State University. And so it naturally seemed like a great time to introduce the Reuther and its collections and activities to people or reintroduce it for people who already know about us. We often find that the general public doesn't often know what archives are or what really happens there. And even within other like information or glam professions, I think there's still a little bit of like um, mysteriousness as to like what archives, what archivists actually do. And that's certainly true across Wayne State's campus as well. So the motivation was to sort of invite people in, fellow academics, library workers, others in the community who, just wonder, what are the things in an archive and what are my archivist colleagues actually doing over there? Um, and then also at the very start of my research, I started with articles about the Reuther Library that were written by our founding director, Dr. Phil Mason. And he wrote a few of these different like introductory articles over the years describing the institution and its collections. And so I started thinking of my article as an extension of that work and an update to it, introducing the institution to a new generation, or like I said, reintroducing it to people who already know about us. Yeah, and so then finally, the ideals on which the Reuther Library was founded, which I'll talk about a little bit later, um, in more in depth, but I think it's subject matter that's relevant today. We collect labor history, and we're seeing an increase in interest in union organizing and labor rights, and so I think all those things together just motivated me to want to write this article.
That's wonderful. Yeah. I wonder if you can just give us a brief overview of the article, and just from your perspective, from the author's perspective.
Yeah, so like I said, it's kind of an introduction or to the Reuther Library. We call it the Reuther for short. It's actually an archive, but it's called a library because its namesake, Walter Reuther himself, preferred that word. He thought that archive sounded too old and dusty, and so we're called a library. Um, but we have archival collections that fall under three main topics, and those include the Wayne State University archives, urban affairs, or Metro Detroit history, really. That's where we focus on like social, political, and economic reform movements in urban America. And what we're most known for is labor history, and we're the largest labor archive in North America. And so the article explores some of the history of how it was established, how it grew, the types of collections and subject matter you can find here, which our focus really is labor, but labor touches a lot of different areas, from like, the different professions that are represented by unions and working conditions of people, healthcare, environment, very broad coverage area once you kind of start digging in. Um, and it also talks about our relationship with some of our donors, the work of the staff, and how the collections are used. A lot of the article focuses on our founding director, Dr. Philip Mason. He was the first university archivist at Wayne State. And shortly after he got the university archive program running, he started building the labor collections. And he just had this knack for making connections and forming relationships with people who eventually became donors and partners with the archives. And most notably with Walter Reuther, who is the president of the United Auto Workers. Um, and they started um, working together as Dr. Mason was getting the program off the ground, and the UAW was the first major union to put their official archives with the Labor History Archive, as it was called at the time. And they later provided the funding for a dedicated building to house the collections. And so by then it included not only UAW, but many other national unions, um, local unions, local affiliates of those unions, related organizations, and of course the university archives. In 2025 marked the 50th anniversary of the opening of the building. Um, there's a lot of other topics in the paper, but I'll touch on maybe just a couple more. Um, so a couple of the things that I think really make the Reuther Library unique. Um, and one of those things is the approach to collection development that Dr. Mason called vertical collecting. And so that meant that records from the so-called rank and file members were considered important, just as important as like the International Union president records. They were all considered valuable and worthy of being in the archive. And traditionally, archives have focused on, air quote, important people, typically the wealthy people in positions of power. But the Reuther Library has always wanted to include people operating at the local level, local leaders and members, the work they're doing in their communities, and even dissident groups within the union. So people who aren't happy with how the organizations are operating and who are pushing back. And some of the union presidents haven't always been thrilled about that, but Dr. Mason was always firm that that was, an important part of the story of labor to include in the archives. So today we don't really use the term vertical collecting, but I think its spirit is still very much embedded in our work. And then another thing I write about is how some of our agreements with the donor organizations work, because it's somewhat unique among archives. Um, some places have similar arrangements, but it's not very common. And so that is with organizations such as UAW, or in my case, AFSCME. I work with the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, which is another labor union. Um, they have their archives here, their official archives, even though they aren't necessarily headquartered here, like AFSCME is in Washington, D.C. Um, we have active relationships with them. They fund the archivist positions, and their records are here and open to the public. A lot of organizations and businesses, they have their own in-house archives. They might have archivists on staff, but they aren't usually open to the public, certainly not to the extent that the Reuther Library is. So it's really a special situation that creates access to all these records that wouldn't otherwise exist. It opens up a lot of research possibilities to people who are interested in that history. So those are some of the big things. But I also talk more about like people who use the archives. People visit us from all over the world. They're working on all kinds of projects, books, podcasts, films. Of course, we get a lot of students, genealogists, journalists, all sorts of people. It's always very interesting to be in the reading room and see who's going to come in today. Um, and then I talk a little bit about some of the specific projects that archivists do, which is, also broad variety of collections care and promotion activities and creative projects and all sorts of things. That's the shortest nutshell I could come up with.
No, that was wonderful. And I really appreciate in reading your article and also hearing you speak about it, the really unique quality of this archive and this collection and the people who keep it alive and keep it going. So yeah. I wonder if you could share with our viewers maybe what is a big idea or takeaway that you would like those watching today or those reading your article to hold on to once they've read or watched us speaking today.
Well, I hope that readers can come away with, first of all, like a better understanding of what an archive can look like and some of the activities that go on behind the scenes. Every archive is unique. That's just their nature. They hold one-of-a-kind documents that you can't get anywhere. So, there's no two archives are the same, of course, but, hopefully learning more about the Reuther can kind of expand that traditional idea of archives as something old and dusty, like Walter Reuther thought they were. But they really are dynamic and meaningful places with a lot of activity going on. And I also hope readers will see something of themselves reflected in the story of the archives, the different collections, and the communities that we serve. I think labor history can often be viewed as just a niche topic, but in reality, it's the history of working people, and that's most of us. It's academics, it's daycare workers, K through 12 teachers, auto workers, custodians, nurses, journalists. Most people have to work for a living, and working people make the world run. So it's important to preserve those stories and, just as much or more so than the wealthy and powerful. And Reuther's history of collecting those records means that there's something for just about everyone in the Labor History Archive.
Well, I want to thank you again for taking the time and speaking with me today. I really appreciate it. I just want to remind those who are viewing this interview that they can still read the article for free, always at the Johns Hopkins Press site for Portal. And again, thank you, Stephanie, for being with me. Thanks to everyone watching today, and keep an eye out for upcoming author interviews. Be
Thank you.
well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.